we had put out a list of violations. We had also put out a flyer called the Parent Spring Opt Out America. And we had listed why parents could opt out. Number one, because of the privacy invasion. And number two is that the government is creating dossiers on every person in the United States, starting with our children, and that this was illegal, and we weren't going to allow the government to do this. And there was an opt-out form. But at the very end of that, we had a listing of all the violations. And one of the violations was that individual teachers were actually acting as psychologists, okay? You talked about those preschool teachers being sent back to school to identify psychological problems. This is a problem, okay? Actually, these teachers in your local school districts are the one who are creating those check marks on your children. So what we have said is that these teachers are actually teaching outside of their profession where they are not licensed. Now, in this bill, in the reauthorization of ESA, and I believe it's on page 255, what they have said is that they are going to provide liability insurance coverage that could be purchased by teachers related to any actions that they perform in the scope of their duties. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to give the teachers an out in this legislation. This is the first I've seen this in any of the legislation that was coming forward, is that they were going to give the teachers a pass for actually posing and acting as psychologists and psychiatrists to identify children with behavioral and psychological problems. This is a big
it's interesting because when you look at what's happening in state capitals, for instance, in Texas, we are in a legislative session. We just passed the early childhood legislation in the House today. There is also a bill that Representative Jason Diabla, who also was a part of the early childhood legislation, he is looking to pass a bill that would allow school districts to require mental health evaluations of students at the sole discretion of the school. Mm-hmm. Yep. So and Jessica, this is a question that I'd love for you, and I know actually I will bring Wade on here as well. Are you seeing federal legislation marrying up with state legislation? And one of the things that's interesting, there was a Labor Department report that came out after WIOA passed, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, that calls for states and legislators to look at legislation and where there is a discrepancy between federal and state law, that federal law would have precedent. That's just from someone who kind of sees it from the federal level, that's just a question that I might have, and please feel free to kind of give us your take of what you're seeing on the ground in Washington as well, and hearing from you are working with grassroots organizers across the country.
Thanks, Alice. Well, I would